So, welcome to Chapter 5, Part 8 of Existential Ambiguity, an ontological analysis of the Buddha's teaching and the ambiguity of existence. A wonderful book by R.G.D.S. Wetimuni. You can download the copy at the address. And by the way, all the letters in the final part of the address are capitals. So it's IC0G20QL, all caps. Today we're going to have a little bit of different episode. We're trying to finish Chapter 5, or at least the first section of Chapter 5, about consciousness, perception, and feeling. Then I want to review and give a little context, because this is the first actual live video of this series. Up till now, all the episodes were recorded almost a year ago here in Isipatana, and we originally posted them as part of a now defunct blog project. And this will be the first one that I do solo and as Ājñā-cakra Tarot. So I would like to kind of make a transition from the old way of doing it to this way of doing it. So first, let's finish up this section of Chapter 5. By the way, I hope you have viewed the preceding episodes, because if you haven't, you're going to be lost. I'm sorry. And especially our study technology and other things that you need to know, or we assume that you know, coming into this series. So with that caveat, let's finish up this section of Chapter 5. Wetimuni continues, contact is thus the coming together of the sense organ, the kind of consciousness involved with that particular sense organ, and an external object which is not the sense organ. In other words, your eye can't see itself, your ear can't hear itself. So the object of the senses has to be something other than the sense organ itself. For example, the experience seeing a tree involves the coming together of the eye consciousness, and that particular thing which is not the eye. In this case, a tree, or anything that we see, or anything that we sense with any of the other senses. Now you might say, well, touch senses the body. So how is the object of touch different from the organ of touch, which is the skin? And of course the answer is we can't sense the skin itself unless it's another part of our skin. So I can certainly sense when I touch my face because I'm touching it with my finger. But my finger can't sense itself, and my face can't sense itself. Now, again, there's another possible problem with kinesthesia and other tactile senses, which involve some computation on the overall sense of touch. In other words, I can feel a certain pressure on certain parts of my body, and I know whether I'm standing up straight or leaning over or turning or walking or moving like that. But these are not direct sense inputs. These are reflexive consciousness based on other sense inputs. In other words, they're combined and computed together. For example, the sense of sight and the sense of touch both go together in understanding motion, for example. Okay, so we're talking about immediate experience, the direct sense inputs, not reflexive experience, which involves some computation. We'll go over this distinction a little bit later. To continue, the union of these three is called contact, and both feeling and perception, in this case, the neither pleasant nor unpleasant bodily feeling, the pleasant mental feeling of joy, the particular shape, the green color, the fragrance, sound, etc., of the tree arise owing to the contact. So we're still on the example of the tree. And Metta Muni's point is that the contact of I see a tree has to do with all these senses coming together at once. So the actual contact is more than just the immediate experience of seeing the shape of the tree, the color, the form. There's also a mental impression. Oh, isn't that a lovely tree? And then the fragrance, the sound of the tree, the wind moving through the leaves, and so on like that. All these go together into the contact experience of that's a tree. So in other words, contact is not immediate experience. It's actually reflexive experience. And it's a higher level of processing than the simple sense, direct impression of the aspects of the tree. Here's a quote from the Buddha. Monks, it is like the heat born, the fire produced from putting together and rubbing two sticks. When those two sticks are separated, that heat so founded ceases, is allayed. Even so, monks, these three feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant, are born of contact, rooted in contact. Owing to such and such contact, such and such feelings are born. Owing to such and such contact ceasing, such and such feelings cease. And this is from the Phassa Mulaka. Mula means the root. So the root of phassa, which is contact, is being described here. And he's making the example of rubbing two sticks together to produce fire. I don't know if any of you have ever done this. I've lived in rather primitive circumstances at times in my life, and certainly have experienced this, making a fire by rubbing sticks together, the friction producing a spark and so on. Then you put kindling on it and very carefully blow on it and try to make it flame up. But as soon as you stop, if the fire isn't going yet, as soon as you stop rubbing those sticks together, the whole thing cools down and you have to start all over again. So this experience that the Buddha makes reference to indicates that contact exists only so long as the actual contact with the senses is there. In other words, it's not a reflective experience. A reflective experience deals with the past or future, but it's a reflexive experience dealing with the present. The same applies to perception, and therefore both feeling and perception are dependent on contact. Contact is the cause. Contact is the cognition for the manifestation of the aggregate of feeling. Contact is the cause. Contact is the condition for the manifestation of the aggregate of perception. So the Buddha is saying that contact and feeling can only arise together. And as soon as a contact is gone, the feeling is also gone. Now, we may have a memory of that feeling, but that's a different kind of experience. That then becomes reflective experience. We're talking about reflexive experience. And why is reflexive experience so important? Because enlightenment happens in reflexive experience. It doesn't happen in reflection. It doesn't happen in immediate experience either. So in other words, enlightenment is neither an immediate direct sense impression, nor is it some calculation on something remembered or imagined. Enlightenment is something that we get from processing a feeling, a sense impression. And of course, in this case, we're talking about mental sense impressions. Primarily, contact is the contact between the individual and external things. This contact gives rise to feelings and perception. In the reflexive experience of the putujana, it would always be a contact between the subject, I, and things. In other words, in the putujana, the contact is withholding or clinging. Pasa sa upadana. So this chapter is actually entitled The Reflexive Experience of the Putujana. Okay, what we're trying to do in this whole series, let me give a little context, a little background, is that we're trying to build up a language that gives us a possibility of building a model of different types of experience. And first we're looking at the experience of the putujana, the ordinary man. Putujana means the kind of men that you can see everywhere. Go anywhere and you can see this type of men. And of course we are also putujana until we come in contact with the Buddha's teaching and actually internalize it accurately, build a working model of it in our own minds, duplicate it in ourselves. And this is called the eye of the teaching, the Dhamma-cakra. And this is what we're trying to achieve by these studies. In other words, we're not studying Buddhism as a religion. We're studying the Buddha's teaching as a path to the end of suffering. The cessation of suffering is, of course, the fourth noble truth. So the question is then, how do we attain this end of suffering? And there, of course, there are many religious style teachings based on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. But what we're trying to do is create a more scientific, a more actually existential description of the Buddha's path based on actual experience. Self-realization can only occur in our own experience. So what is that experience like? How does self-realization feel? What does it look like? How can we model it? These are all the questions that we're trying to answer. And of course, what we have to do before we can even begin that discussion is to define all the terms, to make it clear exactly what the Buddha is talking about, and then find it in our own experience. Once we can do that, then we can start to put things together into a model of the Buddha's whole teaching, the whole context, all Four Noble Truths. And so with that in mind, I'd like to go back and review actually what we have covered so far. Way back in chapter 3, we began with 3 kinds of experience. First, let's talk about immediate experience. Immediate experience is concentrated in the present, and it's based on the senses, the 6 sense bases: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and the mind. So what happens? The inputs of the senses are coming into immediate experience in the present, and there is no processing involved. It goes directly into awareness. Now there's another kind of experience, reflective experience. And reflective experience is more about the past and the future than the present. The present recedes into the background. Immediate experience is very much ignored, actually. And instead, we focus on memory of the past and imagination of the future. This creates a kind of consciousness called ontological consciousness, where we can only be aware of something if we have an ontological model of it, if we have a term for it, if we have an understanding of it, if we know how it fits with all the other pieces of our experience. Otherwise, we're likely to miss it because we don't have a verbal tag. We don't have a symbol. We don't have an abstraction or a model that fits this experience. So the weakness of reflective experience, besides the fact that it's not in real time, it's in the past or in the future. The weakness is if our ontology is not complete, if our ontology does not possess a description or a model of a particular kind of experience, we'll miss it. Even though we may have experienced it, we won't get it. We won't understand it, and we'll just forget about it as if it never happened. So this ontological consciousness feeds into the awareness as symbols, as words. And this is why most thinking is actually talking to ourselves. Well, this happened and then that happened and then I felt this way about it and so on like that. We talk to ourselves constantly. And this chatter is ontological because it's based on a background systematic ontology or analysis of our previous experience. But finally, we talk about reflexive experience. And in reflexive experience, we concentrate again on the present. The immediate experience that we were talking about earlier, the sense impressions, now becomes the object of our consciousness. And we talk about this kind of consciousness as ontic consciousness. Ontic means what really is right now in the present, what exists in the moment, rather than in the past and future. So in ontic consciousness, we lose sight of the past and future and concentrate on the immediate experience of the present. However, there is still a layer of processing that goes on in our awareness, and this is called reflexion with an X rather than reflection with a C. So again, why is reflexive experience so important? Because reflexive experience is where meditation happens. Reflexive experience is where enlightenment happens. Now, that doesn't mean that we're against reflective experience, okay? Reflective experience is certainly a necessary part of learning the Buddha's teaching. But as far as putting the Buddha's teaching into action, reflexive experience is where it's going to happen. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about paticca-samuppada, or dependent origination. Dependent origination is in many ways the heart of the Buddha's teaching. It is a model showing how the experience or how our consciousness leads to suffering. And it shows exactly the chain of cause and effect leading from the beginning to the end of each cycle of being or becoming. So as you can see, it begins from ignorance, fabrication, consciousness, name and form, six sense media, contact, feelings, and so on. So far, what we have talked about in this presentation, in this series, goes from ignorance through contact. And we're going to talk about the rest of the things as we go on in the future. But right now, what I want to do is review what we know about these first 6 elements of the paticca-samuppada. Now, dependent origination starts from ignorance. And this is where the puthujjana lives. The puthujjana is an ignorant person, an ordinary, uninstructed, untrained, run-of-the-mill, just completely natural, ordinary, hoi polloi. And Puttu means everywhere, flat, level, ordinary. In other words, everyone's more or less on the same platform. They may be rich or poor. They may be intelligent or stupid. They may be man or woman or child or old person. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter because they're all ignorant. They're all on the same level. Okay, even a great scientist or philosopher with many degrees is still ignorant in the way that the Buddha describes ignorant. What does he say? And what is ignorance? Not knowing stress, not knowing the origination of stress, not knowing the cessation of stress, not knowing the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress. This is called ignorance. Of course, stress here means suffering, dukkha. So anyone who doesn't know the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path to the cessation of suffering, basically is a putujana. And so we all start out this work, we all start out this path as putujanas. Now, some people may have a better karmic situation. They may have better previous activities in their previous life or in this life. And so they can make quicker progress on the path than someone without that background. But still, the starting point, when you first walk into a Buddhist temple or you first open a book on Buddha's teaching, is ignorance. You are a putujana. So you have to accept that. Then everything else becomes clear, because what we've been talking about in this series so far is the reflexive experience of the putujana. Let's go on. The next stage of paticca-samuppada is fabrication, sometimes translated determinations or formations or conditions. And what this is basically a story that we make up about our experience. What does the Buddha say? Avidya paccaya sankhara. Avidya paccaya means from ignorance as a requisite support. Sankhara means fabrications develop. From ignorance as a requisite support, fabrications develop. In other words, ignorance is the cause of fabrications. If we weren't ignorant, we wouldn't fabricate. Instead, we would meditate. So, because we're ignorant, because we don't know the Four Noble Truths, then we start to fabricate. And what is that fabrication? Creating I and mine. So we've been over this in tremendous detail in the previous episodes from Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the reflexive experience of the putujana. And we go deep into detail in the description of how the putujana makes an I and a mine from each and every sense perception. So what does the Buddha say about fabrication? These three are fabrications: bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, mental fabrications. These are called fabrications. So bodily fabrications means in and out breaths. Verbal fabrications means mental chatter, mental conversation. And mental fabrications means the creation of an ontology. So here we come back around again. Now, how are we going to know what to fabricate unless we have some previous experience, unless we can reflect upon what has happened in the past and say either I do or I don't want this to happen again in the future? That's reflective consciousness. So the putujana engages in a great deal of reflective consciousness. He takes a great deal of time and trouble to go over the past and anticipate the future, and then fabricate his intentions based on his experiences in the past and desires for the future. So you could shorten that by saying that a person's ontology determines their intentions. It also determines the limits of their experience. Because if you don't have something in your ontology, you can't imagine it, and so you can't desire it, so you won't be able to fabricate it, and so you won't experience it. It's just as simple as that. We become what we desire according to the limits of our karma. Now, there's also another point here, which is that all of these things that we're mentioning in the paticca-samuppada, the chain of cause and effect, are not actually linearly related. It looks like a nice straight line going from ignorance all the way down to suffering. But actually they're all interrelated. And there are numerous feedback loops and, multidimensional relationships between these different things. So even though it's in a nice line, don't think that just a linear causal relationship. Nevertheless, the Buddha says that fabrication exists because of ignorance as a requisite condition. If we weren't ignorant, we wouldn't fabricate. Like I said, we would meditate. So what comes next? Consciousness. The Buddha says, Sankhara paccaya vijnanam. That means Sankhara paccaya, from fabrications as a requisite support. Vijnanam, consciousness develops. From fabrications as a requisite support, consciousness develops. So if you don't have a fabrication for something, if you don't have an ontological category for something, you won't be conscious of it, even if it happens right in front of your eyes. There's a lovely story that I like to tell about this. I was doing some research on the invasion of Mexico by the Spanish. And the Spanish were able to conquer Mexico, even the capital of the Aztecs, which is now where Mexico City is, or which was where Mexico City is now, with only a handful of men. And what happened? Well, when they first came to Mexico, they came in these galleons, Spanish galleons, 3-masted schooners. And the Indians, the Aztecs, had never seen an ocean-going vessel before. I mean, they had fishing boats and things like that. Nothing on the scale of these galleons. They were huge, beyond anything anyone had ever seen before. So what happened? The Aztecs didn't even know, didn't even notice, or didn't even register the fact that they were there. So the Spanish got to come in, anchor, and land, set up their camps, and get everything ready before the Indians even began to say, I wonder if this is a problem. And the other thing they had was armored soldiers on horseback. So the Aztecs had never seen armored soldiers on horseback. So they thought, well, who knows what they thought? But they couldn't fight them. Anytime they saw them, they simply panicked and retreated. So they retreated all the way to their capital city, and then the Spanish came in with 2 divisions of armored horsemen and just finished the place. So with about 10,000 or 20,000 mounted troops, they defeated several 100,000 Aztecs, took over their whole empire, and that was that. Why? The Aztecs did not have an ontological model of the technology used by the Spaniards. The Spaniards were able to walk all over them. What's that wonderful quote by Arthur C. Clarke? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So, on the other hand, any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from technology. There has to be a way to do it. There has to be a technique, which is what technology is, knowledge of technique. So the techniques that allow us to attain enlightenment are described by the Buddha, in these scriptures, the suttas, his lessons or his sermons to his disciples. And everything that we are doing is based on that. We're trying to bring these suttas into Western language so that people can digest and understand what we're talking about and develop the proper ontological categories to deal with it. Now, as you know, we've been through consciousness, and the Buddha says there are 6 classes of consciousness: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and intellect or mind consciousness. And this is called consciousness. Consciousness does not exist all by itself. It is always based on a sense impression. So that means the 6 sense bases are also prerequisite for consciousness. Well, why aren't they there? They are. Because just like there's a feedback loop between ignorance and fabrication, Because you're ignorant of something, you fabricate it. Because you fabricate it, it's not really based on the truth, so it's more ignorance and so on. And similarly, there's a feedback loop between fabrication and consciousness. That we fabricate something so that we can be conscious of it. And because we're conscious of things, then we fabricate things in terms of them. So we start building a house of cards. We make one fabrication and then we build something else on top of that. And we saw that back in chapter 4, how the different types of fabrication or consideration or generation of ideas leading to the concept of I and mine are like layers of software built on top of each other. So this is like, analogy is conceiving. When you conceive something, you make an object, a thing, pregnant with something else. You add something to it. You change it. You make it into something that it wasn't before. So what we're doing in consciousness, in fabrication rather, is that we are taking the things that we're conscious of, and then we're adding layers of fabrication to them. So in other words, we don't just go ignorance, fabrication, consciousness. We go ignorance, fabrication, ignorance, fabrication, ignorance, fabrication, fabrication, consciousness, fabrication, consciousness, and so on, building up layers and layers like a house of cards. So where does it go next? Name and form. And name and form is exactly what we have in our minds when we encounter reality, either reflectively or reflexively. We have different names for things, and those things have particular forms that are recognizable. I'll give you an example. A chair. Okay, if I was to take this chair, this nice office chair, and take a sledgehammer to it and bust it all up into pieces and to make a pile. Now, is that a chair? No. It's the same materials. Everything is there. Nothing is gone, but it doesn't make a chair. Why? You can't sit in it. So we have this name, chair. And what does chair mean? Actually, something that you sit in. So even if I was to take this chair and take it apart and bend it all up, and all the same things are there, it's not a chair anymore. Maybe it's the parts of a chair or the pieces of a chair, or maybe it's just a pile of junk. Because we have name and form pre-existing for the concept chair. Now, let's give another example. Let's suppose we run into an enlightened person. And the enlightened person is just sitting there blissing out. And we say, hey, you want a job? You want some money? Come on, let's get some money and go out and get drunk. And the enlightened person is like, right? So let's say this is a putujana who doesn't know anything about enlightenment. And he says, what's he going to say to this? You're crazy. He will not be able to recognize that the person is enlightened. Even if he says, well, why don't you want to go out and earn some money and go get drunk? And the enlightened person is saying, I have all the happiness I need within myself. I don't need to go out and get drunk. I don't need any money. I can beg for a little food and I'm perfectly happy. It doesn't matter how much he explains it. The putujana is still going to think he's nuts. Why? He doesn't have any name or form for an enlightened person. He doesn't have any fabrication for an enlightened person. He doesn't have any consciousness that even hints at the existence of such an experience. The only thing he has is, oh, there are people who think the way I do and they're sane, and then there are people who think in a different way and they're nuts. So what's going to happen? When the putujana encounters an enlightened being, he is going to mistake that person for a nutcase. Or maybe these days is a third possibility. He's going to think this is a scammer. Somebody who's pretending to be enlightened to make money or something like that. So depending on the name and form, the model of reality, the array of possibilities, your opportunity space for perception and experience, your matrix of allowable states of being. I don't know how else to express it. You are going to interpret your experience in terms of that model of reality that you have in your mind, and not otherwise. You can't interpret it as anything other than the pre-existing models. So name and form. Now the Buddha describes it. He says, Vijnana Pacaya Nama Rupam. Vijnana Pacaya means from consciousness as a requisite support. Nama Rupam, name and form develop. Name and form develops from consciousness as a requisite support because it's simply, again, there's another feedback loop between consciousness and name and form. You're only going to be conscious of things you have a name and form for. And you only have name and form because you're conscious of so many things through your senses. So name and form and consciousness depend on each other and feed back to one another. And in this way, we build up a whole structure of possibilities of being and becoming. That doesn't mean that they're real. For example, I know about horns and I know about horses. So I could say, the horns of a horse, a horned horse. But is there such a thing? No. Could there be such a thing? Not really. I mean, I suppose we could operate on a horse and put some cow horns on it. Well, what's the point? That thing can be imagined, but it does not exist. In the same way, many things that we think are real are actually just imagination. For example, I, mine, corporations, nations, money, and so many other things. Status, pride, beauty, ugliness. All these things are simply abstractions that are culturally determined or culturally, reinforced or conditioned until we simply treat them like assumptions. But structurally, what they really are name and form. The Buddha says, what is name and form? Feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. This is called name. And the four great elements and the form dependent on the four great elements. That's earth, water, air, and fire. This is called form. This name and this form are called name and form. So just see what a huge possibility space name and form is. But even so, a large part of our possibility space for perception, for consciousness, for being and becoming is illusory. And why is that? Because we treat abstractions as though reality. That's why I said, for example, a corporation. A corporation begins from a fictitious name. If you want to create a corporation, what's the first thing you do? Fill out a fictitious name statement and file it. And then you file your articles of incorporation with the state. And some bureaucrat signs off on it, and boom, you got a corporation. It's just words on paper. That's all it is. It's just an agreement. In other words, certain people make a name and form in their minds that now corporation XYZ exists. And that brings it into being. Well, does it really exist? If I say, where is your corporation? Can you show me your corporation? The most you can show me is like the corporate paperwork. And that's just an agreement. So part of our process of eliminating suffering is to go through name and form and determine which is real and which is illusion. Next is the six sense media. Now the six sense media have come up before in consciousness and in name and form. So that means, again, there's feedback. There are connections between and among these different stages of paticca samuppada. What does the Buddha say? Nama rupa paccaya salayatanam. Nama rupa paccaya means from name and form as a requisite support. Salayatanam, the six sense media develop. So the six sense media develop from name and form as a requisite support because we need a way to be aware of them. We need a way to reach out and touch something somewhere. So we take a body. We take a name and a form so that we can be in touch with other names and forms. So far, everything has been happening more or less on the mental level. But this is now where we start to reach into the body, out through the six senses, and contact the world around us. And the Buddha describes what are the six sense media? These six are sense media. The eye medium, the ear medium, the nose medium, the tongue medium, the body medium, the intellect medium. These are called six sense media. So we can start to see that all of these things are defined in terms of one another, that there's a web of causality between and among them. If we were to do a detailed ontological analysis, which actually isn't a bad idea, but it would probably be a very complicated one, even among just these six things, because they all have to do with one another. You cannot separate them. In other words, it's impossible to do elementalism and say that consciousness exists all by itself. Name and form exists all by itself. Ignorance exists all. No, you can't, because they are all part of a package deal. And that package deal is called fabricated being. Being and becoming, in a word. Bhava. And this bhava means fabricated being and becoming. And it is the cause of suffering. Paticca samuppada is the anatomy of bhava. This is how we are being and becoming. The Buddha says, Salayatana paccaya paso. Salayatana paccaya means from the six sense media as requisite support. Paso, contact develops. So contact develops from the six sense media as we reach out through the senses and actually contact the world. And how does the Buddha define it? He says, what is contact? These six are classes of contact. Eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and intellect contact. This is called contact. So again, this is a whole huge array of possibilities. And then, of course, after that, we get feelings. Phassa paccaya vedana. Phassa paccaya means from contact as requisite support. Vedana means sensation develops. So from contact as a requisite support, feeling develops. Feeling or sensation are synonymous. So this is the beginning of the process of becoming. This is why we're focusing on it so much. Because it's much easier to change at this level than once you get past feelings. Once you get past feeling, it's almost impossible to change the outcome of the process of becoming. Why is that? Because at that point it becomes more about hardware than software. At this point, we are still more or less in software, although contact is there, six sense media is there. The best thing would be if we could change our fabrication, if we could eliminate ignorance, if we could alter our name and form. So that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to change or update our software and actually change the process of becoming before it gets involved with the hardware of the body, the senses, and so on. And to change the way we look at things, to change our consciousness, to change our awareness and our point of view. Why is that? Because we want to become something different from what we are. To do that, we're going to have to understand the process of becoming. because one of the aspects of what we're trying to become is someone who is expert at being and becoming, who can become the highest thing that's possible to become in this world, and that is a seika, someone who knows the Buddha's teaching, someone who understands how the Buddha's teaching works. The Buddha's teaching, the Eightfold Path, is a process of becoming that is unique and different because it's a process of becoming that leads to the end of becoming. It's a fabrication that leads to the end of fabrication. And this can be experienced in the here and now. So it's a type of reflexive experience. But reflexive experience, the structure of our computation during reflexive experience is based on our reflective experience in fashioning the name and form and the fabrications that we use to cognize the world. The different patterns of energy, or the different patterns of meaning that we apply to our experience and use them to evaluate our feelings about our experience. Let me give you an example. The ordinary, typical putujana, if he goes into a social situation and a beautiful girl comes up and starts making conversation with him, he's going to think, oh, this is very nice. His feeling is going to be, this is a pleasant experience. Yeah, very good, very good. But a person who is trying to observe celibacy, a man, let's say, who's trying to observe celibacy, goes in a social situation and a pretty girl comes up and starts making his acquaintance, he's going to be uncomfortable. He's going to be like, well, this is not so desirable, and he's going to try to get out of there. An enlightened person in the same situation is going to be neither pleased nor displeased. He's going to be neither desiring nor lamenting this situation. He's not going to be accepting or rejecting it. He's simply going to watch it as it is, and if it seems to be leading in the direction of shedding and liberation, then okay. And if it seems to be leading more in the direction of fabrication and entanglement, then he'll withdraw. But in no case will he either reject or accept it. In no case will he either think, oh, this is good or bad. Or will he think, this is pleasant or unpleasant, pleasurable or displeasurable. It simply is what it is. And so the enlightened person looks at everything that way, neither accepting nor rejecting, neither feeling attraction or repulsion, like or dislike. He doesn't judge his experience because actually, from an enlightened person's point of view, all experience is something to be let go of, something to be rejected. It's just that some forms of experience are less pernicious or less harmful than others. So anyway, the enlightened person is on a different platform of consciousness. And the same with feelings. These 6 are classes of feelings. Feeling born from eye contact, feeling born from ear contact, feeling born from nose contact, feeling born from tongue contact, feeling born from body contact, feeling born from intellect contact. This is called feeling. So that pretty much wraps up the first section of chapter 5. Now the thing that I'd like to explore with you is how this book and the information that Wetti Muni is presenting fits into the big picture of Buddhism. Well, you might notice that the Paticca Samuppada is a bunch of red balloons there on the left side of the circle. And if you've seen some of our other videos, you know that the Eightfold Path is a series of green balloons on the right side of the circle. What do they have to do with each other? Well, the point is that as you get these various functions of being and becoming under control, you begin to advance on the Eightfold Path more or less automatically. In other words, in the beginning, the first item of the Eightfold Path is faith. So what is faith? Well, faith is the opposite of ignorance. I think I don't like really the translation faith as much as I do integrity. Integrity. It means that a person is going to follow the precepts. They're going to be moral, truthful, non-stealing, non-cheating. They don't want to cause pain or inconvenience or fear or insecurity to any being. They begin to develop actually love for all beings. They want to spread this wisdom, this knowledge. They want to help others. So a person like that who is moral has faith in the Buddha's teaching. He upholds the Buddha's teaching. He doesn't question these moral rules. He follows them instead because he realizes, well, this is for the benefit of all beings, especially myself, because I'm creating good karma that's going to allow me to attain higher states of enlightenment later on. So in this way, he gains control over or eliminates ignorance. And similarly, fabrication, consciousness, and so forth. As we gain control over these aspects of being and becoming, then we automatically advance on the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path, in other words, is not a dogma. It's not a doctrine. I don't like it when I see Buddha's teaching translated as doctrine. No, Dhamma does not mean doctrine. Dhamma simply means what is, the way it is, and the essence of the way it is. Why is it the way it is? Well, it is the way it is because most of us are putujanous. We're ignorant. We don't know what we're doing. We're suffering. And we're trying to stop suffering by doing things that create more suffering. Duh. So when we actually accept the Buddha's teaching, we stop doing those things. And instead we start doing things that actually reduce suffering, not only for ourselves, but for others. And if we follow, or when we follow that path to the very end, we eliminate suffering completely. We not just counteract it with pleasure, but we actually reach a new platform of existence where there is no suffering, where there cannot be any suffering, because there is no fabricated being. Once we actually transcend conditioned being, there is no more suffering. There's no more space, there's no more time, there's no more causality, etc., and so forth. It's a very, very high state, and it can be developed even higher than that. But anyway, we're still in the very beginning of all of this. What we're trying to do is understand how we got ourselves into this mess so that we can begin to pull ourselves out of it. So obviously, the first thing that we have to do is educate ourselves. If we're going to overcome ignorance, we have to start learning. That's why I always ask people to go back and look at our videos from the beginning. This is part of a series. It doesn't stand on its own. It's not meant to. If you come into the middle and just start watching, you're going to be very confused. I'm sorry. It's not like I want it to be that way, but that's just the way it is, because everything depends on what went before. And if you follow our videos from the beginning, there's a bridge or a path from where most people are today, the state of the putujana, to the beginning of the Eightfold Path. And now what we're doing is we're actually start to work on the eye of the teaching. We're actually starting to see things the way the Buddha sees them, and to duplicate the meaning of the Buddha's suttas, such that we can actually practice them the way they're made to be practiced, or the way they're meant to be practiced, and gain the results. So now I want to ask you something very important, and we'll see who actually watches these things all the way through. should we go on with this series? This is more or less of a formal series. I'm taking it from Weti Muni's book, following in his line of reasoning. It's not perfect. He reaches a point where he gets over his head, out of his depth, and he starts speculating. But it's pretty good for the beginning of the path. It's a pretty good way to start, especially for Westerners, especially for those who've had contact with existential thought, which means anybody who's in Western civilization, which means practically everybody in the world right now. So, should we continue, and should we keep the same format? Ronnie and I can continue to have these conversations over Skype and record them. The only problem is there isn't going to be a live video like this, and the sound quality is going to be poor. Or I could continue doing these like a solo, like I'm doing this one, and give kind of both sides of the conversation, or try anyway. I hope it's not too boring. And if we continue, should we continue at the same level of detail? And should we also try to bring out some of the applications, or some of how these topics are relevant to living in the world today? So if you could leave us a comment on the video and respond to these questions, the feedback would be very valuable. So I guess that's enough for today, and we'll see you next time. Buddha Sharanai.
Yeah.